So today, I want to talk about how to think like a futurist. And as a futurist, I speak at many conferences around Australia, I do consulting with clients, and many of them are asking me, what do we need to do to be able to do the sort of thinking that you do? And how do we also think like a futurist? And it's not that they want to think about all this fancy technology and trends that are coming their way. That's kind of interesting and it's fun to talk about with your family and friends. But how does that make a difference to you in your everyday business? And how do you use that futurist kind of thinking in your business? And really, thinking like a futurist is all about making better decisions and faster. Because one of the problems that we have, and one of the challenges that many organizations are facing, is that it's much harder to decide because you think that you might make a decision now and then the world changes around you, so that decision becomes irrelevant, or you have to make another decision tomorrow. So what's the point of deciding? Well, there is a point of deciding, and it is about how to make. So if you understand a little bit about what's coming up in the future, then you can also make smarter decisions and you can make them faster. So let's start. Let's start with a little bit of an interactive exercise, because as I said, I like to make my webinars interactive. So how can you improve your decision? So think about a decision that you're going to make, that you have to make, an important decision you have to make. And I wonder, what sort of strategies do you use when you think about decision making? So the picture that you saw on this slide here, Chip and Dan Heath have written a book called Decisive, and they have identified 4 things that improve decision making. And I'd like you to tell me, what do you use to improve your decision making? So if you can just type them in the question box, please. I'll keep this one anonymous, but just type in the sort of things that you use to improve your decision making. So let me give you an example of the sort of thing I might be looking for. So for example, some people say sleep on it. That's one of the ways that they make better decisions, is that they give themselves a little bit of time to think about their decision. Another one is that they make a list of pros and cons. So they draw a line down a bit of paper and write down the pros and the cons, and they use them to evaluate their decisions. Okay, so those are not 2 of the 4 answers that the Heath brothers came up with, but I wonder, what are yours? What do you do to improve your decision making? Okay, so I'm just going to stop and wait for people to type in the question box. How do you improve your decision making? Okay, so someone says gather more data. Someone says create 3 good options and pick the best one. Okay, someone says test a decision. So I presume that means make a decision fast and then test it. Right, so someone here says, I'm a list maker. I write plus and minus of different options, give them each a weighting, because some are more important and more immediate than others. Someone says, choose important over urgent. Yeah, interesting. Okay, good. Stephen Covey talks a lot about that. How do you make sure that the urgent doesn't get in the way of the important? Okay, so thank you for playing along for this first little exercise. And here's what the Heath brothers found in what you do in how to make better decisions. So here's another one that's come in, which is a pragmatic approach. Okay, I'm not sure what that means in detail, but maybe we'll see how that matches up with the research that Chip and Dan Heath came up with about how to make better decisions. So here are the 4 things that they came up with. So number 1, widen your options. So give yourself more options. In fact, we've got an example there of somebody saying find 3 options, so go beyond 2. So one of my first bosses said to me, there's no such thing as a number 2. And this was when I was a software developer in my very early days out of uni, in my early 20s. He said, never have something where you can only have an on and off switch, because there'll always be a 3rd, 4th, 5th infinite number of options. So widen your options. So that's one of the things that the Heath brothers said. The second one is test your assumptions. So again, I had a comment there that said make a decision fast and then test it. So absolutely, go in there and test your assumptions, and also when you make a decision, test the decision as soon as possible. Take action. Get more distance. So this is not just saying sleep on it, but this is saying imagine the effect of your decision. So you make a decision. What will be the impact of that 10 days from now, 10 weeks from now, and 10 years from now? So rather than just be governed by what's the immediate impact going to be, because then you might be unfairly making a decision based on short-term impact. Short-term impact is important, but also think about medium-term and long-term. And the last one is prepare to be wrong. So have backup plans, or at least have a way of saying, be open-minded that if you take action and the decision doesn't work out the way that you want, that you're willing to change, that you're willing to spin, you're willing to go 90 degrees or 180 degrees and make another decision. So those are 4 things that the Heath brothers came up with in their research in how to be more decisive. And I highly recommend the book. The book Decisive is a very easy read. If you've read any of the books by Chip and Dan Heath, you'll find that they're pretty easy reads, but this one's particularly easy and particularly useful as well. And the reason I'm talking about decision making right at the start in a webinar about thinking like a futurist is thinking like a futurist is very much about that. I want to help you make better decisions and to use the skill of foresight when you talk about any innovation and change in your business. And acting with foresight, the first thing you do is to scan wider before you narrow down your decision to make a decision, and then you go deep to actually implement that decision. So many people don't do this first step well enough, so scanning wide. So we're going to spend most of the time today talking about this, scanning wide. So thinking like a futurist is the first step in that is to scan wider, know a little bit about what's happening in the world around you, so that then when you come to this narrowing down stage, you've got more information, more data to be able to make better decisions. Okay, so if you're looking at these, going back to the 4 things that the Heath brothers said, in fact, 3 of them are about being thinking like a futurist, and the one we're going to focus on first is this widening your options. Also, getting more distance and looking ahead is also valuable, and it's also what futurists do. And also futurists also say test your assumptions, because they say try things and see what's happening in the rest of the world, and also test, because the world's going to change fast around you. But let's start with this first one. So widening your options, how do you scan wider? And this is kind of the interesting stuff that I get to do as a futurist. I look at what's happening. I look around. I look beyond what's happening just in Australia to look what's happening globally. I look beyond what's happening in one industry and look across multiple industries. I look beyond what's happening in my generation and look at what other generations are doing. And I have to do this as part of my job, because it's part of the expertise that I bring to my audiences and to my clients. Most businesses, they don't have to do it, so unfortunately they don't do it. So I want to give you a couple of little techniques that you can use so that you can start doing this and make it a habit, because it's going to be really valuable for you as a leader to be looking ahead. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I want you to be a possibility thinker. And here's what I mean by that. When I show a picture of a self-driving car to a child, their usual response is something like cute or cool, because they see this little thing. They've never had a driver's license before. They've seen cars on the road, but they've never seen a car like this with this kind of little funny smiley face on the front. And they think it's kind of like a cute little car, and they'd love to be driven around in that for the rest of their lives, because they've never had the experience of driving. When I show adults this, their response, rather than being cool cute, is generally, oh, that's a problem, or that's a little bit scary. And they always come up with reasons why self-driving cars won't work. Because they say things like, oh no, we like driving, you'll never get people to give up driving. Or they say things like self-driving cars will never be as safe as human drivers, which actually is not true. Even now, when they're driving on roads with human drivers around them, self-driving cars are safer. But anyway, that's the sort of excuse they come up with. So I'd like you to think about, when you see some new technology, some new trends, are you at this yes but end of the spectrum where you're thinking, oh, what could possibly go wrong with it? Or you at the cool or cute end, or what I call yes and. So you're looking at the possibilities and you're looking at the positive opportunities rather than just the problems and challenges. Now, don't worry, there are plenty of people who will point out problems and challenges for you, but I want you to be a possibility thinker. And even if you're not quite at that yes and end of the spectrum, I'd like you to be at least thinking, that's interesting, tell me more. But please don't be always thinking yes but, yes but, yes but, because then you close your mind to possibilities and opportunity. Just by the way, if you have never been in a self-driving vehicle, there are trials around the world now. There's one in Perth where if you happen to live in Perth, and I'm just looking at the attendee list, I don't know if anyone on the list here that I can recognize lives in Perth, but if you're in Perth, then you get the chance to try out a ride in a self-driving bus. So it's free. It's provided by the RAC, our automobile club here in Perth, and you just book it online and you can go for a little 20-minute ride up and down the Perth foreshore. So I've tried this. I've gone there, as you can imagine, had a go in the self-driving bus, and so it takes about 6 passengers, and there is an operator in there with like a little joystick and a big red panic button, but he never had to use it. He only had to use it once. He only had to intervene once when the bus stopped on the road because one of the cars that was parked on the side of the road was parked a little bit too far out from the curb, and the bus couldn't get around it. Actually, could have got around it, but because of the laws, the state government only allowed this self-driving bus on the road if it was programmed to never cross the white line in the middle of the road. Even if it was safe to overtake, it wasn't allowed to do that. So they had to program it that way. And because this car was parked over from the curb, the bus had to stop. And then the human operator had to then press the button to let it go around. But apart from that, it was completely autonomous. So it drove up and down the road, stopped when pedestrians were crossing the roads, allowed other cars to turn. It did a right turn at an intersection, made sure there was no other traffic coming, and it was completely safe. So that's one of those technologies that's going to affect a lot of industries, not just cars and not just car manufacturing and car sales, but it's going to affect a whole bunch of industries. So we should know about this. Even if you don't get the chance to use it yourself, you should know about it. Here's another example. This is virtual reality. I was speaking at a real estate conference a couple of years ago, and realestate.com was demonstrating virtual reality walkthroughs for home inspection. So if I'm looking to buy a house or buy a home, even on the other side of the world, I don't have to visit there to walk around the home. I can use a virtual reality headset to do that. And that at the time, a couple of years ago, was pretty new. Now it's not quite mainstream, but it's much more common in the real estate industry, and virtual reality is becoming more common in other industries as well. And the next version of this is not just that you can go through a virtual reality experience, but you can upload yourself into it. So if you want to try out virtual reality, you can get Google Cardboard, which is almost free. It costs about $10. Or if you want to splurge, you can spend $50 at JB Hi-Fi and get a virtual reality headset that you can then stick your smartphone into and have virtual reality experiences. And soon you'll be able to upload yourself into it. So you can upload a virtual version of yourself. There's a guy in Melbourne who does this. So he's got a studio where he's got 87 cameras, and you go in there, it clicks a button, all the cameras take a photo of you from different angles, and he creates a 3D model of yourself. And I went to this Futurist conference a couple of years ago as part of my own professional development, and he was demonstrating this. He didn't have his full setup there. He had only 5 or 6 cameras, but he was doing 3D facial scans. So of course I had to get it done. So I went in there. I sat down, he took a photo of my face from these different angles, and 3 days later, he emailed me a personal 3D model of the half my head, which I can rotate around. And you can imagine the full version of this, where you can upload yourself into a virtual reality world. So in a couple of years, I will be able to do this webinar where it's almost like, in fact, it'll feel like I'm in a classroom or in some sort of meeting room, and you're also in the meeting room. I can see you, you can see each other, you can pass notes to each other, you can stand up and write on the whiteboard just as you would do in reality, but it's all happening in virtual reality. Okay, so these are sort of things that you should be thinking about, even if you think virtual reality has no current application in my business, maybe it has a future application. So I'm going to get you to do an exercise in a couple of minutes to think about what sort of technologies could come along and disrupt your industry, either positively or negatively. Let me give you a couple of other examples first, just to give you some more ideas to start your thinking, and then I'll let you loose and let you do the exercise yourself. Okay, so when I speak at healthcare conferences, I often paint this scenario for people. When somebody is having a heart attack, in the not too distant future, there will be a self-driving ambulance that comes along to pick them up. So it might still need a paramedic, unless we have robots doing that, but it might still need a paramedic, but doesn't need a driver. And also, let's say we're in the time when there are no human drivers on the road, all the vehicles on the road are self-driving and they're wirelessly connected, so they know to give way to emergency vehicles. So the ambulance doesn't need flashing lights and a siren anymore. On the way, there'll be either a chip implanted under the patient's skin or embedded in their clothes, and that'll transmit data to artificial intelligence software in the cloud that'll do a diagnosis and tell the cardiologist so she's ready when the patient arrives on her doorstep. Also on the way, in the ambulance, there'll be a 3D printer that'll print a stent for that patient, for that operation, and a drone will deliver equipment and medical supplies, again, so the cardiologist is ready and the hospital and her medical practice doesn't have to carry all this stock. So all of this technology exists at the moment. It's not connected in this scenario yet, but it all exists and it will be connected soon. And then we have things like this, which are nanotechnology, robotic surgery. So maybe all of this will become obsolete when we have these nanotech robots. So you're having a heart attack, you swallow a pill, and a tiny army of robots goes to work inside you doing the surgery. Okay, so what could possibly go wrong in that scenario? Okay, but joking aside, this technology is available. It's out there at the moment. And if you're in healthcare and you're in any part of that patient's journey, then you might be, it makes sense for you to be ahead of the curve in understanding some of these technology trends. Okay, so I've given you examples from transport, I've given you an example from real estate, I've given you some examples from healthcare. But even if you're not in these industries, just understand that this technology, some of this technology may affect you as well. And even professional speakers are not immune from this. So this is Sophia the robot, a humanoid robot powered by artificial intelligence. And Sophia has been speaking and doing keynote presentations at conferences. Now, generally, it's a little bit of a gimmick at the moment, but she does make keynote presentations and she can answer Q&A sessions from the audience. So even my job as a conference keynote speaker is going to be affected by technology like this, like Sophia the robot. Okay, so I've spoken for a while now, and as I said, I want to spend most of my time today talking about this idea of scanning wider, but it's time for me to turn the table, to turn it over to you. So I'm interested to know what will most disrupt your industry in a positive or a negative way. Now, I don't want you to type in the answers in the question box, because if you do that, then only I'll see them and I can read them out. But what I'd like you to do is go to askgihan.com. And if you do that in your web browser now, it'll come up with a kind of a bulletin board. So let me show you that. It's coming up now. And what I'd like you to do is click the little pink button down here and add your contribution. So as you can see, I ran this webinar a few weeks ago and I've kept the responses from that webinar. So what I'd like you to do is, like, what's your job? What's your role? So I've put down conference speaker, and then what's going to disrupt it? Sophia the robot is. Someone here is a consultant, said that chatbots and AI. A trainer said this, management speaker, and so on. So whatever your role is, what do you think? What's some technology that may be disrupting or will disrupt your industry? Okay, so we had a few responses already from last time. So there's some that I prepared earlier. I'd like you to think about what will disrupt yours. Okay, good. We've started seeing one. And I'll keep this one open here. And you'll also see it on your screen if you're in that, if you're on that page. So it's just askgihan.com. Let me see. So, yeah, okay. So virtual presence in the factory or wherever. I'm interested in that. Interested to see what that, to know what that means with clients. Yeah. So another thing that's happening with training is that a lot of the training is happening not only with virtual reality, but with augmented reality. So augmented reality is where you have a digital world added on top of your real world. So, for example, I was working with a client in the air conditioning industry, and what they do is when they send out their young technicians to do work at customer premises to do repair and maintenance work, they also, when they go out there, there's a senior technician back in the office who can look through the junior technician's smartphone, and they can help the junior technician do the work because the junior technician takes a live video feed of the customer's air conditioner or the insides of it after they open it up, and they can help them with the diagnosis. So that's happening now with like remote training, and it'll also be augmented in the future where the junior technician, even without a person back at the office, holds up their smartphone to the device and it does a diagnosis and then tells them, like guides them through the actions. Okay, someone's added here online simulations. Interesting. Yep. So virtual, yeah. So you will have a lot of simulations now. Simulations are big. So some very big companies like Ticketmaster is doing lots of simulations with things like customer service before they unleash their staff on real customers. Okay, good. I'm going to keep that open, and you can keep adding to that if you wish. Let me go back to the second area, which we'll cover. But the point I want to make here is that the wider that you think, and the more that you think about new and interesting technologies, the better. Okay, so let me give you another way that you can get ideas for your industry. And this is looking outside your industry to getting expertise from other people outside your industry and people who've got different roles. So the picture here is of a carpenter. Now this carpenter is doing the right thing because he's wearing his safety mask. But lots of carpenters at work, they don't wear their safety masks. And that's, of course, a health hazard for them. And the reasons are varied. So some of them just forget. Some of them find it too itchy to wear. Some of them just find it inconvenient, or it takes too much time, so they don't bother. And some Harvard researchers were interested in how do we get carpenters to wear their safety masks more without having to stand over them and force them to do it. And what they did was they asked 3 groups of people, how can you help carpenters? What ideas have you got to help carpenters encourage them to wear their safety masks more? So they asked other carpenters. They asked roofing contractors because they figured this is a related trade and they might have solved a similar problem in their industry, in their trade. And they also asked rollerbladers, people who ride rollerblades. And they said, how can you help carpenters? What ideas have you got for carpenters? And what they found was that the rollerbladers had better ideas for carpenter safety than the carpenters or the roofies did themselves. Okay, so the further away they were from that field, the better. And it wasn't just because rollerbladers are more creative. They actually found the same thing worked in reverse. So when they asked carpenters for ideas for rollerbladers, they actually got better ideas for rollerblading safety than the rollerbladers had themselves, because the rollerbladers were too close to it, or the carpenters are too close to their industry. So one of the best things you can do is look outside your industry for ideas that might help you in yours. So, for example, Mercedes-Benz Airport Express was set up about 10 or 12 years ago, and one of my colleagues, speaking colleague Belinda Yabsley, who worked for Mercedes-Benz at the time, she set up Airport Express in Sydney and Melbourne Airport. So if you're not familiar with it, if you drive a Mercedes-Benz and you're flying out of Sydney or Melbourne Airport, you can drive up and leave your car at Airport Express. And it's like an upmarket service where you drive your car there, it gets valet parked, it gets washed and detailed while you're away. It has the online check-in booths, which was set up at a time before most airports had them inside the airport terminal. And then, of course, someone will drive you to the terminal, drop you off, pick you up at the end, take you back, and then you can pick up your car again. And when Belinda was setting this up, she didn't look around to see what was best practice at airports around the world. She looked at what are hotels doing, because hotels treat their customers as guests, and they try to give them a five-star experience as soon as they walk in. So she looked at hotels and said, how can we duplicate the hotel experience for someone dropping off their car at the airport? Another example, this is a bed in the maternity ward at Epworth Hospital in Melbourne. And it's actually not quite that. It's actually a bed in a room at the Grand Hyatt, the Park Hyatt in Melbourne, which is across the road from Epworth Hospital. And Epworth and the Park Hyatt have an agreement where they've set up a whole floor of the Hyatt, which is purely for mums who've given birth. There's no complications. The baby doesn't have to go to neonates or anything, but they want to keep mum and baby overnight. Instead of keeping them in a hospital ward, they take them across the road to the Park Hyatt, and they have a night in this really nice room at the Park Hyatt. And they find that obviously it's a better experience. It's all covered by private health insurance. It also allows the rest of the family to come and stay. It frees up a room in the maternity ward at the hospital, and it's cheaper than keeping them in hospital. So what the hospital did was they looked at how do we introduce hospitality to the hospital experience. So this is a really valuable thing for you to think about as well. How do you look at other industries and ideas from their industries and from their roles, and how can they help you with yours? So the idea is, don't just look at what you know and your expertise, because you might be too close to it. Okay, so as I said, I want to spend all my time today talking about the first of these three areas around acting with foresight, which is this area of scanning wide. I'm not going to go into the other two in detail. Let me just mention one thing about narrowing down, because it's about decision making, and it relates to the webinar that I'll be running next week about decision making. So once you scan wide, you get more options to work with. And if you remember, Chip and Dan Heath said that one of the best things you can do to make better decisions is to widen your options. But there is one downside to that. And the downside is when you have more choices, sometimes you're spoiled for choice and you don't make a decision at all. So let me, before I finish up, share with you one piece of research that was conducted by Dr. Sheena Iyengar at Columbia University. And she was looking at how people make decisions when they have more choices. And in her experiment, she set up a little kiosk in a shopping mall, in a shopping center. She set up a little kiosk where she was selling jam. And she had two versions of the experiment. In one, the kiosk had 6 jars of jam, and they were all for sale, and they were just testing how many people came along, had a look, and then bought the jam. In the other version of the experiment, they had 24 jars of jam. And again, they just tested how many shoppers came by, had a look, and then bought. And what she found was that when there were 24 jars of jam, more people stopped and had a look. But fewer people bought, because when they had more choices, they were overwhelmed by the choices, and they were much less likely to make a decision. They were just thinking, it's way too hard, I'll just not buy anything, which is bizarre when you think about it, because they still had those same 6 choices that the other shoppers had, and they could have just chosen from those 6, but they were overwhelmed by having too many choices. So how do you manage that? So this is the tricky balance. I want you to think wider so that you've got more options to choose from, but now I also want you to be able to make choices when you've got so many options. So how do we do that? I'll talk about that in the next webinar. So today, thank you for coming along. Just a reminder to please complete the exit survey that'll come up in a couple of minutes, and I'll send you my Think Sharper report, which will help you just think about some of the things, some of the challenges that many workplaces are having when they're looking at innovation and change in this fast-changing world. Just a reminder, in case you missed it or you haven't already signed up for it, the next webinar is coming up next week, but this current webinar series that you're on now is ending today. So this is the last webinar I'll run in this series. If you'd like to get the next webinar, please, please, please go to seeingintothefuture.com and subscribe to that. You won't get any more webinars in this series, and just because I'm respectful of privacy and confidentiality and looking after email addresses, I won't be sending out mass emails to this webinar list. So if you'd like to get the next webinar and stay on the list for this content, then please join the other webinar series at seeingintothefuture.com. So I hope you got some value from today's webinar. You're always welcome to email me if you like, if you've got any questions, comments, share some ideas at gihan@gihanpereira.com. And if you'd like me to come and speak at your conference about some of these ideas or other things around being fit for the future and thinking ahead, then please check out my speaking topics and more information at gihanspeaks.com. Thanks everyone for coming along. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar series so far, and I hope to see you on the other side of the weekend at the next webinar where we talk about decision making. Thanks everyone, and bye for now.